Good morning, this is Marshall Davis. This episode examines the 25th saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, "Love others like your own soul. Protect them like the pupil of your eye." This saying is two parts. The first is love others like your own soul. Now, many translations use the word brother here. Love your brother. One translation uses the word friend. But it should be obvious that this saying is not limited to males or biological siblings or even those we are friendly with. We are very familiar with the translation neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, which follows that, makes it clear who Jesus means by neighbor. It's everyone. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the saying that I wrote on a piece of cardboard and I held up at a street protest a couple of Saturdays ago. Everyone else at the rally was holding up signs that had to do with the president or with ICE, immigration customs. But I chose to display one of the most important commandments in the Bible, according to Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said the two greatest commandments are to love God with all your soul and to love your neighbor as your soul. Now, some people do not understand how I can participate in a street protest and also talk about non-duality. I've had people write me and ask me about that. They see it as contradictory. I explained in a blog recently the connection between those, and if you're interested, you can find my blog on Substack. That particular post is entitled Christian Non-Duality and Social Conscience. In short, my participation, I say, has nothing to do with partisan politics. It's not about political parties. I would be proud to display that sign with that saying at any gathering, at any rally by either of the major parties or any party. The saying, love your neighbor as yourself, has to do with morality, which flows naturally from spirituality. It's about individual morality, but also social morality and national morality. It's about we not only as individuals, but how we as a people in a country treat others. It has to do with how we see people, which in turn determines how we treat people. Jesus instructed us to see others as ourselves, and that means to treat others as we would treat ourselves. Here in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus puts it this way: love others like your own soul. Now that wording is a little bit different than what we are familiar with. I prefer the use of the word other in this saying rather than brother or friend or neighbor or some other translation. This might sound a bit different, but it opens up the saying, I think, to new interpretations and new understanding. Love others like your own soul. Now we need to look at the word soul. That can have a lot of different meanings. And when Jesus uses the word soul, he is using it in the Hebraic sense and not in the Greek philosophical sense. The word soul is a synonym for self, what we see as our identity. To love another as our soul means that we broaden the sense of our identity, of who we think we are, to include another. In the biblical story of David and Jonathan, it says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now that phrase is repeated a bit later in the story, where it says, "And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul." Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the nature of this love between David and Jonathan. One thing for sure is that it is an example of loving another as your own soul. When we meditate upon the saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, we see that Jesus is equating self with other. In reality, there is no distinction between self and other. There really is no such thing as other. We are all one. We are all one self, you could say. Now, we are under the illusion that deep inside we're all different. That is the cause of all of our problems. That sense of differentness breeds anxiety and fear. It can lead to hate and violence. In truth, we are all the same. We are one self, one soul, with a capital S. That is the Vedanta teaching that Atman is Brahman, that the individual is the universal. The individual self is the universal self. Emerson called this the oversoul. Now, we could come at this another way and say there's no such thing as a self. That's the Buddha's teaching of no self. All is one, which means that we are all the other, if you want to call it that. In either case, when you look at another through the eyes of Christ, what we see is ourself. That is why Jesus taught, "As you do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, so you've done it to me." Either way you come at it, this is non-duality. The important thing here is not to make this then into a philosophical idea or a theological doctrine or something like that. The important thing is to see this, to see it firsthand, to see through the eyes of Christ, to experience this for oneself, to know that this is true, and not just think it is true or believe it is true. When we know it is true, then we live life from this reality. When we see the truth of universal self, or no self, then the result is love, unconditional love. The Buddha called this compassion, but it is the same thing. It is seeing the world from the perspective, not of separateness, but of oneness. Seeing it from the perspective of ultimate reality and living as an expression of this ultimate reality. That's what Jesus meant when he said, "I and the Father are one." And when he also said, "I can do nothing without the Father, and I can do only what I see the Father doing." Let's move now on to the second part of the saying. Jesus says, "Love others like your own soul." Then he says, "Protect them like the pupil of your eye." Now, this second part has no parallel in the canonical teachings of Jesus, but there are some references to the pupil of the eye, or the apple of your eye, in the Hebrew scriptures. The psalmist prays to God, "Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings." Moses describes God's care and protection for Israel, saying, "In the desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye." Now, that phrase, apple of his eye, is a poetic way of talking about the pupil of the eye. Jesus says, love others like your own soul. Protect them like the pupil of your eye. We protect our eyes. We use eye protection. When I am splitting firewood from my wood stove, I use protective eye goggles. I had a friend who did not use protective eyewear when he was splitting wood, and a piece of that wood flew up and hit him in the eye. It was a very serious injury. He almost lost his eye. But after a couple of surgery over many months, the physicians were finally able to save his eye. But this all happened because he did not protect his eye. Unfortunately, he did not learn a lesson from this. A few years later, at the height of the pandemic, he refused to get the COVID vaccine. And he tragically died of COVID-19 unnecessarily. Jesus says we are to protect others the way we would protect the pupil of our eye. In the next saying in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus continues the same theme about the eye. He talks about sawdust and splinters as the eye. We're familiar with that saying from the New Testament Gospels. We'll deal with that next time. Here Jesus is talking about protecting others the way you would protect your own eyesight. The interesting thing about this metaphor is that Jesus is probably alluding to spiritual sight here as well as physical sight. Jesus makes this connection between physical sight and spiritual sight quite a bit. One example is in the Gospel of Thomas, where he heals a man's sight, a man who was blind from birth. And he did this healing on the Sabbath, we're told. And the Pharisees therefore got mad at him because he was healing on the Sabbath. But Jesus uses this as an opportunity to talk about spiritual sight and spiritual blindness. He says to them, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." The proverb says, "There are none so blind as those who will not see." We heard in the last episode Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? He's talking about spiritual sight here. Spiritual blindness is much worse than physical blindness. I have a friend in Melbourne, Australia, who might be listening to this right now. He is physically blind, but spiritually, he can see clearly. He's one of those friends who will encourage me regularly with emails. And I hope that I encourage him by my words that I speak in these episodes. Jesus came to open the eyes of the spiritually blind. When our eyes are spiritually opened, then we cannot imagine not seeing ultimate reality again. But sometimes that happens when darkness does happen to some people again after what seems to be a spiritual awakening. It is terrible for them. It is called the dark night of the soul. The good news is that dark night of the soul is a prelude to permanent awakening and seeing. When we see others as Jesus sees others, when we see them as ourselves, then we love others as our own soul, and we protect others as we protect the pupil of our eye. That is to see the world as Jesus sees it. That is to have the eyes of Christ. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.